Good morning and welcome to this CIBSE webinar where we will be looking at the new Heat Network Code of Practice CP1 2020, which was published at the turn of the year. I'm delighted to say that we have a panel of 4 speakers who are very well versed in both the policy and the technical details of heat networks, and they will be able to take us through both policy matters, and 2 of the authors will be explaining the major changes in the Code of Practice. So without any further ado, our first speaker this morning is Aaron Mornin, who is Head of Heat Networks Policy at the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. And Aaron is going to give us an overview of heat networks policy. And just before Aaron starts, I will remind everybody that the webinar is being recorded and you will receive a link to the recording tomorrow morning. So without further ado, Aaron, over to you.
Thanks very much, Hal, and good morning, everyone. I mean, before I get into my presentation, I just wanted to start by saying thanks very much for inviting me, and what a fantastic achievement it is that you're publishing CP1 2020. I know it's been a tremendous amount of work from yourselves as an organisation, and I just wanted to say, you know, what a fantastic achievement it is and a testament it is to a growing and maturing heat networks market. I know that there's been a lot of work from our side in BEIS, in particular, shout out and thanks to Graham Wendon from the Heat Network Delivery Unit, who has been helping on development of the technical standards for a number of years now. I just wanted to talk through, you know, the wider policy context and give a sense of how we see this maturing technical standard fitting into the wider vision for a regulated heat network sector. So I click move on. There we go. So just to give kind of some broader context, you know, the importance of heat networks for decarbonisation and for net zero. Clearly, cooling and hot water in buildings, as I'm sure many of you will be aware, is, you know, one of the larger contributors to our national CO2 emissions. And heat networks at the moment are around 2% of the market. We very much envisage a significant scale of growth in the heat network sector in order to help the UK decarbonise its heating, and in order to meet our net zero target. We've been clear that to meet net zero will require almost entire decarbonisation of the UK's heating sector. And we very much see heat networks as being an integral part of that. We've got some kind of indicators here of the scale of growth that we envisage in the heat network sector that will be necessary to meet our net zero target cost effectively. And there are a number of kind of published documents, including our previous clean growth strategy, where we said that it could meet between 17 and 24% of UK heat demand by 2050. We also kind of agree with the scale of ambition of the Committee on Climate Change, who also pointed to similar numbers. So it's an incredibly important sector. It's one that we know needs to grow very quickly, and the government is committed to supporting that with policies in a number of areas. It's probably worth explaining briefly as well, you know, how we see heat networks contributing to net zero. Clearly, there's some examples there on the left, but heat networks are, as we often say, kind of technology agnostic. They can be equipped with a number of different low carbon technologies, and that flexibility is one of their major strengths, whether that be large solar thermal plants, large scale heat pumps, waste heat recovery. There's any number of low carbon heat solutions that they can make use of. And they are particularly cost effective for dense urban areas where there is a large scale of heat demand, and that's where we primarily see them being deployed. The flexibility that they offer enables them to be deployed in many different and varied locations across the UK. And in order to meet that scale of ambition, we are committed, as I said, to supportive policy in a number of areas, and I thought we might just kind of run through a number of those. So since 2013, government has had the Heat Network Delivery Unit. This is a team of specialists within BEIS who provide advice and early stage grant funding to local authority sponsored projects in England and Wales. And they have been behind development of many important projects over the years that support the growth of the heat network sector. We've also got heat metering and billing regulations, which further bolstered and matured the sector. So these require minimum standards on how customers should be metered and billed for their heat consumption, and also started government's formal data collection of heat network sector. So if you're a heat network, you are required to report back to the Office for Product Safety and Standards for your location and some very basic details, which enables us to get an overview of the sector. In 2015, it was announced that a spending review, the government had won £320 million, is going to be giving £320 million of capital funding to the heat network sector, and that capital investment project is very much underway. It's launched in 2018 and has already committed tens of millions of pounds to the sector, and some groundbreaking projects, particularly looking at kind of mine water projects in the northeast, where the heat network investment project is driving the sector to develop new and exciting heat sources. That investment project continues until 2022, and if someone is not familiar with that, we can certainly distribute the contact details of Triple Point, who are our delivery partner for the project, and can put you in contact with business development managers there. In March last year, we announced a further £270 million of capital support for the heat network sector in the shape of the Green Heat Network Fund, and that is to transition the sector away from new networks built on gas-based kind of heat technologies. The Green Heat Network Fund will be supporting heat networks that don't use gas and trying to shift the sector towards the use and implementation of large-scale heat pumps or waste heat recovery systems or solar thermal. And a consultation on that scheme just closed, and we're going to be issuing a kind of consultation response and further details on the design of the scheme soon. And then the part of the overall framework that, well, the part of our overall plan that I'm most responsible for, the market framework. Building on a report from the Competition and Markets Authority in 2018, government has committed to statutory regulation of the heat network sector in order to ensure that consumers get the same level of protection as consumers get on electricity, gas and water networks. But we very much see, just to skip on this slide, we very much see the market framework as not just supporting consumer protection, but also growing the market and decarbonising it. So we have said that, and in a consultation that we issued last year that closed in June, we have said that we want consumer protection for pricing, quality of service standards and transparency of contracts that are given to heat network customers. But we also want to use the market framework to grow the market. We've announced that we're going to be giving equivalent statutory rights to heat networks as those enjoyed by electricity, gas and water companies. So those are the same rights to be able to dig up the streets in the same ways, to be able to have rights to compulsory purchase of lands, for the same negotiating rights as those other utilities have with linear obstacles like railway lines and canals. And we've also said that we want the market framework to support a new heat network zoning policy that was announced in the Energy White Paper last December, and this would be a system whereby areas within cities and towns are designated as where heat networks are the most cost-effective solution for the consumer and the most cost-effective way of transitioning to net zero. And we are planning to consult on how that heat network zoning can be rolled out and designed in summer this year. And our commitment is to introduce zones by latest 2025 to further support the growth of the sector. And then finally, the market framework is aiming to decarbonise as well, building on capital investment that we're making through the Green Heat Network Fund, but also in the 2030s, starting to implement regulations that encourage the sector to transition away from gas and towards lower carbon heat sources. So just to give a quick overview of the timeline, just to flick back one slide. So as I said, we had a report from the Competition and Markets Authority in 2018. In 2019, we wrote to all heat networks saying that regulation is coming, that we encourage them to improve their standards, and that is to consider signing up to the Heat Trust, which is the voluntary consumer protection code, but also to start thinking about how they get ready for sector regulation in ways such as improving their technical standards. We had a consultation last year. We revised the metering and billing regulations in November as well to make sure that they're even more targeted and work even more effectively. And we will be shortly setting out our plans for legislation for the sector. And we are committed to introducing that legislation this Parliament to get the market framework off the ground and to introduce a statutory regulator. So I thought I'd go into a bit more detail on the areas we consulted on last year, particularly in relation to technical standards. And I think, so we've given some indication of the responses that we got to some of our questions on the slide. But I think overall, it just demonstrates that there is widespread support for the development of kind of more mature technical standards, and support as well that in time government can build on the great work that industry is doing in developing these standards to implement them in the regulation and to ensure that minimum technical standards for how heat networks are designed, built and operated and maintained are included in regulation, and that those standards are consistent across the sector. And then finally, just on next steps. So we are planning to publish our government response to our consultation this spring. As I said, we're planning to announce our plans for legislation in the coming months. And as I said, we're committed to legislating this Parliament, and we are continuing to support the development of technical standards like CP1, and we are discussing with people who are on this panel and others in industry about how we can ensure that we integrate the fantastic work that industry is doing in developing these technical standards into a longer term coherent framework for ensuring we get consistent coverage of technical standards across the sector and integrating into regulation. So thanks very much for all of that, and passing on to the next speaker.
Thank you very much, Aaron. That's a very helpful overview. Before I introduce our next speaker, I'd just like to reinforce your thanks to colleagues in BEIS, particularly Graham Wendon, for their support for the project, and also to say that CIBSE does want to acknowledge the financial support that we've received through BEIS, without which we would have struggled to produce the new code of practice. So we're going to move on now, and our next presentation is going to be given to us by the head of policy at the Association for Distributed Energy. ADE have worked very closely with CIBSE in the development of CP1, and we are very grateful to them for their help and support as well. And Caroline is now going to give us an outline of what the industry is doing in response to the initiatives that we've just heard about and how they're going to be using CP1. So over to you, Caroline.
Hello, good morning, everyone. I hope you're well. And just to yes, reiterate everything that's been said, it's great to be here and to be celebrating the publication of CP1. As Hal said, I just wanted to give a quick industry perspective on the overall policy picture that we see for heat networks and the industry's ambitions for moving this sector forward over the next few years. Firstly, I wanted to touch on some of the key pillars that Aaron has already spoken about in terms of the regulation that is coming in the next few years and the broader measures that we see as critical to supporting investment. If we start with consumer protection standards, I think firstly, I would like to say that the industry has been working for some time to put together customer standards as the heat network market remains unregulated and in preparation for regulation as we grow. Aaron has already touched on Heat Trust, which is a not-for-profit consumer champion for the heat network sector. It provides consumer protection standards and independent access to the Ombudsman for those heat networks who are registered to it. The other thing that the industry has proactively done over the last year and a half is to come together. So about 13 companies came together to voluntarily commit to a series of commitments in response to the exceptional circumstances that we've seen from COVID-19, aligning ourselves with many of the commitments that were made by the gas and electricity sectors. Going forward, the industry is obviously working very closely with government to ensure that the design of regulation is appropriate for the market as it stands today and as it grows, and that in particular that regulation fits with and can work with the vast range of players that we see in this market, including very small heat network operators. The final thing on this that I wanted to note is that the Heat Network Industry Council is also working on this in terms of our ambitions in the longer term. The Heat Network Industry Council is a group of companies that came together along the lines of what was a very successful model developed by the offshore wind sector through their Offshore Wind Industry Council. Through our launch last year, we set out a number of provisional but very ambitious commitments covering a number of areas, of which the customer experience for those on heat networks is one. We will be refining those commitments and offers and finalising them over the course of this year. Secondly, on technical standards, obviously the industry has been enormously involved in the development of CP1, and going forward, we will also be turning our attention to the future development of assurance schemes and the broader framework that sits around those technical standards to make sure that they have teeth. On environmental standards, the industry has been clear that we want to ambitiously put forward commitments around decarbonisation and the leading role that heat networks can play in the decarbonisation of our heating overall. The Heat Network Industry Council has provisionally pledged that all new heat networks will be decarbonised by 2030 and all heat networks, existing and new, will be decarbonised by 2035. Over the next few months, we will be refining those commitments, looking and publishing the strategies that sit underneath them and how a large range of heat networks that we see in the market and how we see those heat networks developing in the future will decarbonise, and finalising those in the run-up to COP. And then finally, I wanted to touch on some of the broader measures that we see as really important to supporting and growing investment in this sector in parallel to regulation. Aaron has already mentioned the statutory undertaker rights that government is intending to include in the regulation, and we strongly support this. Further to that, as Aaron mentioned, the introduction of heat network zoning is crucial to ensuring that we have a much more strategic approach to where heat networks are sited in the UK and to strengthening the incentives to connect in those areas where they are the right decarbonisation path. We will be doing much more work on this, as we have for the last few years, through the Heat Network Industry Council as well as with government, to get that right over the next few years. I think then finally, I also wanted to touch briefly on the reform of carbon taxes and levies that we also see as crucial to getting to a thriving decarbonised sector in the next decade. Obviously, this is a topic that touches more than just heat networks and will be needed for heat decarbonisation as a whole. But I think decisions over the next few months, over the next year, in terms of where those taxes and levies sit, and particularly any changes to taxation on gas are going to be really important. Finally then, I just wanted to think a little bit about what comes after regulation and some of the really big decisions that are still to be made and will significantly impact the heat network sector's ability to grow. I think firstly, there are clearly strategic decisions still to be made on heat decarbonisation pathways and the ability of industry to invest and make very substantial progress in the 2020s. We've seen that government now has a very ambitious target of 600,000 heat pumps per year being installed by 2028. There are very ambitious ambitions for the beginning of the deployment of hydrogen, both for heating and for industrial process, starting toward the mid-2020s and beyond. And as Aaron has just pointed out, both the sector and the government have very strong ambitions for the growth of heat networks over this decade. The current policy framework is not going to get us there. And there are some big decisions, I think, that are still needed on how we will push progress, particularly on heat networks and electrification, whilst ensuring that hydrogen can fulfill its proper role. Secondly, as I'm sure is clear to everyone, the infrastructure needs of a decarbonised heating system in the UK are going to be vastly different from the infrastructure needs that we have today and that we've had traditionally. We're going to see very large expansion of heat network infrastructure, expansion of hydrogen infrastructure, the expansion of electricity infrastructure, and then likely the shrinking of at least parts of our existing methane gas networks. There is still a big question about who pays for this and the way in which we allocate those costs in a way that doesn't distort either investment decisions or day-to-day energy use. I think those questions remain unanswered to a large extent. And then finally, I just wanted to touch on the changing interactions between our heating systems and the electricity system in the UK, for which obviously heat networks will play a very significant role. At the minute, the way in which we procure and reserve capacity at a national level and our national balancing markets remain very carbon intensive. And we are just kicking off a discussion now about how we decarbonise those markets, and as we develop local markets for balancing, for other network operability, how we can do that in a way that doesn't need fossil fuel resources. Heat networks and their ability to be flexible and to provide storage should play a really significant role in that. But those are still discussions to be had. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Caroline. That was very helpful. And we're now going to move on to our third and fourth presenters, and we're I'm very grateful that this morning we've got two of those who did a huge amount of the work on the Code of Practice. And Phil Jones is going to start off the presentation, and he's going to be joined by Martin Crane. And I think on behalf of everyone at CIBSE, I would like to say a huge thank you to Phil and Martin for the amount of work that they put in, whilst at the same time recognising that if you look at the front of the Code of Practice, you'll see that they were part of a very large team of people who contributed and reviewed and commented on the code. And it really has been a huge collaborative effort. So thank you to all concerned, but particularly to Phil and Martin. Phil and Martin are going to run us through the major changes in the code. And before I ask Phil to talk, can I just reassure those who have been asking questions, the recording and the slides will be made available after the webinar, and the link should be sent round to everybody who's attended tomorrow morning. So I hope that reassures everybody that you'll be able to go back and look at the slides again later. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Phil, and at some point he will introduce his co-presenter, Martin. Thanks, Phil.
Thank you very much, Harold. I'm hoping you can all see my slides and hear me well. So here it is, CP1 2020 at last. The first thing I want to say is thank you very much to Martin Crane, my fellow author, but also to our other third author, Paul Woods, who isn't with us today. He's got other commitments, but actually huge amount of work from the team. But Harold is absolutely right. The whole sector has done a fantastic job on developing this code of practice. And I'm hoping that my slides will click through. Not yet, I'm afraid, Lucy. Splendid. So we first produced CP1 in 2015, and the 2020 version is still a voluntary code of practice. It sets minimum standards. It is not guidance. I think it's has a status above guidance documents, but it also recommends not just minimum standards, but best practice standards to go beyond the minimum. It is a requirement under all HNDU and HNIP Heat Network Investment Programme projects. It's technical, but it is very now process driven and is very much being used as a in specification by developers saying, I want a code of practice, I want a heat network to meet CP1. So it's actually changing the whole market. I think it will, I'm hoping, underpin future regulatory framework that Aaron and Caroline were talking about, and it could even be mandatory within the heat zones that are being worked up under that regulatory framework. And you see the sort of style of document on the right hand side. And can I click next slide? I'm trying. So the structure of the code, it is very structured. So going from the left-hand side, there are 7 stages, and some of you may be familiar with the diagram, the arrow diagram from 2015. 7 stages, essentially 7 big chapters. Each chapter has a series of objectives, and so you can see in the middle where it says feasibility, the feasibility stage has 13 objectives, and each objective looks like the objective 2.4 in the middle there, and you can see 2.41 is a minimum requirement. There are 540 minimum requirements in 53 objectives across 7 stages. But we're not just setting minimum standards, we're covering, putting forward recommendations for best practice that you can see on the right-hand side. But most importantly, at the end of every objective, there are key outputs. And these are generally reports, diagrams, schematics, hard copy stuff that actually we can record at each stage. And I will come back to the use of those key outputs as we go through. So, yeah. One of the great themes that we have put much more emphasis now on is the client setting a really good brief with his advisors, MEP team at the beginning of the project, and they're making sure that what the developer actually wanted gets done, so they can actually write what they want on the tin and then sort of prove it does what it says on the tin in operation. But we have put in place a process which checks, is it doing what it said on the tin at the end of every stage? These are very long, complex projects. If you leave it to operation, you could end up with a poor heat network, and then it's sort of too late to fix, it's too expensive to fix. And so we're checking at every stage at the very least. Much improved procurement, much clearer roles and responsibilities, and much greater emphasis on compliance. So next slide. Throughout the whole document, we have actually set a series of performance metrics, and you can see they are around economics, reliability, energy efficiency, energy center efficiency, network heat losses, and environmental performance. The client could add to these, of course, but these are the metrics that we've set. And these, again, metrics will be checked at every stage of the process, so that if the economic viability looks poor at the end of design, then, you know, what are we going to do about it? How do we mitigate that? Not leaving it too late. The other great theme that we have built into the new CP1 is a much greater emphasis on customer satisfaction. I don't think that was there. I'll freely admit it wasn't as strong as I would have liked to have seen it in 2015. But this again now starts at the briefing stage and runs right throughout the whole document. And it's very much complementary to the Heat Trust. We work very closely with Heat Trust, and it's not replacing Heat Trust. It sits nicely alongside it, and it sets a very early intention. It insists a minimum requirement, says, thou shalt, Mr. Developer, set an early intention written down and sent to the Heat Trust that we are going to join up to the Heat Trust. And then at the back end of the process in operation, the Heat Trust, they would actually sign up to the Heat Trust. So much more emphasis on customer protection, satisfaction, information and reporting back to the customer. And we do need to emphasize, we get too technical about all of this. We get stuck in the weeds of Whitworth threads and things. Actually, we just need to make sure the customer is happy, in particular Mrs. Jones. If Mrs. Jones is not happy, I know about it. Minimum requirements, so much bigger. So lots more to read, sorry about that. But there's lots more to do, lots more to provide minimum requirements around. And also, we've tried to tighten up all of the definitions, the words, the terminology that we've used throughout CP1. A good example of that is the diagram on the right, to actually try and more clearly set out primary, secondary, tertiary separation. And we've looked at those 3 areas separately for heat losses. for very good technical reasons that I won't bore you with right at the moment. But you can see at the bottom we've set minimum requirements on kilowatt hours per dwelling for the secondary side to get rid of hot corridors in summer and high heat losses and so on. And next slide, please. Sorry, I'm pressing my keyboard. Lucy, help. Thank you. So the other, back one, please, if you're in control. No. Back two now. Yes, that's the one. Thank you very much. Sorry, everybody. A little bit of delay on the keyboard and so on. So we have recognised that we really needed to attack massive oversizing of pipe work and indeed HIUs, and we have now focused CP1 around Danish standard DS439 in terms of diversity and pipe sizing. We also recognise that the DS439 process was being misused in the UK, and thanks to Fairheat for a huge work on an appendix in CP1 now, which shows a clear worked example of how you actually pipe size using DS439 to prevent that misuse. And the other fantastic achievement is BEIS actually put some funding in for translating DS439 into English, so that is now available for the UK market. And we've provided some guidance on space heating diversity. So this is all aimed at getting sizing right, avoiding oversizing. And so I'm going to now hand over on the next slide to my fellow author, Martin Craig. Martin, over to you.
Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me? Yep. Yes, so as well as making everything more efficient, losing less heat, the code includes a bit more on plant sizing of heat pumps and CHP, and trying to drive the sizing of those to be based on the economics. So you actually test the economics of the different sizes of plants and pick the one which gives you the lowest cost of heat. And as part of that, we're looking at how electricity tariffs vary during the day-night tariffs or seasonal time of day tariffs, so that if you're running your CHP plant, you run it when the electricity's export value is high, and when you're running your heat pump, you run it you try and maximize the use when the electricity price is low. And so the picture there has the heat pump going off when the electricity is expensive, and that's where your thermal store helps cover the peaks, and also enables you to turn the heat pump off when the electricity is expensive. And that can realize quite a lot of extra value for schemes, which quite often doesn't seem to happen. And that's in at the feasibility stage, as it affects the economics, and also in at the feasibility stage because it tends to result in larger thermal stores, which can be a bit of a pain to incorporate. So the earlier you know about that, the better. Next slide, please. Right, thank you. So, and then trying to reduce the heat losses. So a very big win was getting, a lot of people worked very hard on getting agreement to be able to lower hot water temperatures from HIUs down to 50 degrees rather than 55. So that means you can try and run systems at lower temperatures in the summer, or if you're all using underfloor heating, perhaps all year round. The drawing there was from a bit of work from Max Fordham on how you can rearrange your risers and laterals to massively reduce the pipe length. So we've taken that on board, trying to limit the sizes of pipes to the HIU, that's quite a large component of the overall heat loss. And so the code sets a maximum of pipe size, the use of variable flow temperatures. We've upped the pipe insulation requirements and try to squeeze down on the possibility of using bypasses, which just to lift or return temperatures. So the code suggests more ways of avoiding the need for bypasses on networks, which is really useful and good stuff. So next slide, please. And then we've worked hard on looking at commissioning and acceptance testing. So there's an example commissioning process, sort of checklist for HIUs to actually check that the return temperatures you're seeing from that HIU meet what your design intention was. And invariably, that's always been issues with space heating setup. So the checklist tries to get all the information about the space heating and the setup of the radiator valves on one sheet, so that the person commissioning can check what the design intent was, what the settings were supposed to be set at, and then you actually use the heat meter to check the end result. It actually works correctly in operation. And also on the checklist of all the other things worth checking, the hot water performance and the temperatures. But the main errors in the past have been found to be the space heating, and that hopefully is a process. It's only an example process. People should adapt to suit their situation as a way of, but it's trying to bring the design criteria right in front of the person doing the commissioning. And then past experience shows the commissioning has been imperfect, and so this is where acceptance testing has really generated really good results on getting networks to work really well. And so the code now requires a level of acceptance testing, and it's a risk-based approach. So if you start your acceptance testing early and it's all going well, you can do less, but if it's not going well, you have to do more and more and more. Or the best practice is to do acceptance tests on everything. And also the other thing that's changed kind of over the years since the last version of the code is we now require that all heat metering has AMR, so all the meter data is read, and we're not very keen on pulses. We're saying should be using MBus, so that automatic meter read data has all this technical detail in it, and so you can use the heat meter data to actually confirm some of the commissioning. And a range of organisations are coming forward with apps and things to help you achieve that using the heat metering. Next slide, please. The CIBSE HIU test provides a really good information base which the code uses to set standards in a nice hard and fast way. So we're saying that the VWATs should be less than 33 degrees, so we can guarantee in good performance from the HIU of a known performance. The HIU test also tells us heat losses, which are useful so we can limit those in the code. And the data in the test also helps set those commissioning requirements. And also on HIUs, the code sets limits on the sizes of HIUs in kind of conventional domestic properties, and limiting that to 40-45 kilowatts. And I think after that, it's back to Phil.
Yes, thank you very much, Martin. That's great. And thanks for all your hard work on the code. Well done. So the other interesting change around that relates to acceptance testing is a reduction of instantaneous domestic hot water temperatures from HIUs. And we've actually set now 50 degrees C generated at the heat interface unit, and a service delivery piece for the customer acceptance testing of at least 45 degrees C delivered within 45 seconds, rising to 50 after that. And so that is actually a clear example of setting acceptance testing levels that are aimed at making sure the customer is happy, comfortable receiving good hot water. This is actually based on work that is going to be published fairly soon by CIBSE in a guidance note, but we've incorporated it already into the code of practice. Next slide, please. So a few of the technical changes, I won't spend a lot of time on this, but we've tried where we can, as much as we can, to set maximum heat losses on primary and secondary and on HIUs, as Martin said. We've tried to focus on reduced return water temperatures across the piece. And we've also tried to set in the minimum requirements of the code a requirement that at design stage you should have the capex model to at least plus or minus 10%. If your capex model is way off, then your internal rate of return net present value is way off, and you don't know whether you're going to get a return on investment or not. But the other theme and technical theme running through the code are lots of changes and improvements around metering. You can see on the right hand side, the diagram is telling users where they should actually put metering in a good heat network that follows CP1. Next slide, please. So the other big change is not somewhat non-technical, it's procedural. We have developed a series of checklists, an evidence pack, and a statement of applicability. And these are not add-ons. They come in an Excel spreadsheet, but they are not add-ons. They're absolutely fundamental to CP1 and to proving that CP1 has been followed. And they provide an audit trail throughout the whole of the design, the whole supply chain. Sorry. So on the right hand side, the top bit is an example. All of this is one example, and there are 7 tabs like this that get handed from one stage to another. And actually at the top, you can see there are objectives there. Have you met the objective? Have you produced the key outputs from that objective? And what is the risk level around that? So that's the bit that proves you've done your CP1 stuff. The middle part is actually proving, have you met the metrics that the developer said in the first place, set in the first place, at each stage, and then a sign-off process at the bottom, and then all of that gets handed over from one stage to another stage to another stage, because it's very often separate people doing design to feasibility and so on. And so we're trying to connect the supply chain, trying to actually provide a sort of forward audit trail, but a backward audit trail as well. You can actually opt out of certain items of CP1 if they are not applicable to your scheme, but you have to provide very significant justification before you do that. But this is all about getting an outcome-based approach, but stage by stage. Next slide, please. So all of the information I've just talked about, all of the key outputs get put into an evidence pack. The evidence pack and performance monitoring gets handed, as I was saying, from stage to stage to stage, and the entire process is developing a well-documented heat network that is auditable and provides a clear handover between the different parties involved. That connected audit trail is fundamental to compliance with CP1 across this very long and often broken supply chain. Next slide, please. So before I go to my last 2 or 3 slides, huge thanks to Paul Woods, our fellow author who's not with us today, and Martin Crane, who is. All of the 50+ experts on the steering committee and the corresponding bits of steering committee. We had over 100 contributors and commentators. We had 3,000 comments. Yes, 3,000. I've still got them all written on my back as scars. But actually, what that's done is brought huge consensus to the whole piece. Huge shout out to Fairheat and Hugh Blackwell and Chris Parslow, because they've had big inputs, but many more. It has been an epic journey, And we have achieved huge consensus, and it is a platform for the future. But before you dive in, Hal, I've got a couple of other slides, very quick ones. Next slide, please. And so in 2012, 13, 14, we realized we were on a journey through a jungle of unregulated heat networks, and developers lacked confidence and customers sometimes dissatisfied. Next slide, please. We are still on that same journey, but where we need to get to is, and you can actually start to see it now, a regulated heat sector, and that's exactly what Caroline and Aaron were talking about, with these minimum standards underpinning them, customer satisfaction of heat trust underpinning all of this process. But what we probably need now is, next slide please, Lucy, heat assurance. Schemes that actually overlay the technical standards to actually make them work in practice, to implement them. A quality assurance scheme for the whole of the UK heat networks piece. And I think that's almost my last slide. So may the code be with you. Have a good read. Back to you, Hal.
Thank you very much, Phil. And if I could ask Aaron, Caroline and Martin to turn their cameras on. We have 10 minutes for questions, and I'm going to rattle through 2 or 3 very quickly, which I might just ask one of our speakers to deal with, and then we might pick up 1 or 2 others that more than one of you might want to comment on. The first one I'm going to ask Aaron, and it relates to the timeline for the legislation around regulation for heat networks. I think it was in the slides, but do you just want to give us a quick target date for having that in place?
Of course, yeah. So it was in the slides, but I appreciate announcements about legislative timing have to be relatively ambiguous. So we've committed to legislating this Parliament. So that's before 2025 for the introduction of a heat network market framework. And I said that we'd be saying more about that legislation in the coming months, and exactly when it'll be timetabled for.
That's great. Thanks, Aaron. And I've got a question for Caroline around energy from waste as a heat source for heat networks, and what the view is on how that might fit in with zero carbon ambitions. And I guess the question there is, what about the carbon that comes from combustion of waste? Can you give us a quick thought on that?
Sure. I mean, I think the ADU's perspective on this is that the ERF fleet that we have at the minute is a crucial part of how we deal with waste in the UK. And if we are going to be burning that waste, we should be using it as efficiently as we can for heat networks. I know that both the government and the waste sector are working very intensively at the minute in terms of longer term strategies and their commitments to reach net zero by 2050. And I think that tied into the efficient use of that waste heat locally is a really crucial part actually of decarbonising heat in the UK.
Great, thanks, Caroline. I'm going to pass 2 in one go to you, Phil, if I may. And I think they're very quick ones. The first is CP1 relevant for communal heat networks or just decentralised? And there's a question about the linkage between CP1 and the BISRIA document BG6, which relates to design responsibilities of construction professionals. Do you have a quick word on those 2, please?
CP1 is relevant to what I would call district heating and communal heating, and we've tried to define the 2 a bit better in CP1, but it also covers new build versus existing as well, so it tries to do all things to all men and women. I've forgotten the second point. Sorry.
BG6, the
BG,
design
yes.
responsibilities.
Yes, where possible, we've tried to actually utilize what is in BG6 and build it in as a sort of running theme. And I suppose the other thing we've done is there are a huge number of references out from CP1 now. So we have actually used CP1 as a sort of central document to actually send people out to all the right references, including the BAYS documents and so on, and ADE documents.
That's great. I'm going to turn to one which might prompt a little more panel discussion. A couple of questions, well, actually more than a couple of questions on temperatures and Legionella. And one or two people asking about whether the 50 degrees is on the primary or the secondary part of the system, and somebody else asking about 50 degrees and the usual guidance in relation to minimizing risks from Legionella. And then finally, there's one observation. If you've got 45 seconds to get up to 50 degrees, doesn't that lead to quite a bit of water being wasted? Now, I'm not sure. I'm going to go to Martin first because he hasn't had a go yet. But if others want to chip in, then do let me know, and you can have a go after Martin.
Yeah, Neil, thanks for that. So 50 degrees is about the hot water. So that's the hot water coming out of the tap. And so your challenge is to get the lowest possible network temperature that enables you to get 50 degrees out of the HRU. And the Legionella basis for that being acceptable is the system volumes are small. They're below the whatever it is, the few litres that you're allowed that qualifies it as a small system. So that's the basis of that. The 45 seconds is shorter than happens in many places. So that's not an easiest target to meet based on it depends on the volume of your pipe work and stuff, and that fit is being chosen to fit with the HRU test, trying to get hot water out of the HRU within 15 seconds. And so, the more you shorten, if you shorten that period too much, you have to go to extreme lengths like hot water circulation systems or trace heating or keeping your heat network much hotter. So 45 seconds sounds like a long time, but actually from the feedback we've had, that is actually shorter than is currently happening in many places. So that's a custom improvement standard that's been put in, and that is only a minimum requirement. So by all means, put in your 10 millimeter pipe and get it to the tap much quicker with much less wasted water. I think that covers anything else.
Is it fair to say, Martin, that I think what you're saying is there's a trade-off between wasting water and wasting energy?
Yes, I think there is, but the main thing is if it's thought about at design, we can the design recommendation within the code is to try to say if you use a manifold and 10 millimeter pipes to your hot water taps, the volume in the pipes is so much smaller that the hot water gets to the taps really quickly, and that's a much simpler approach than trying to keep the HRU standby hotter or trace heating or domestic hot water circulating systems. But
I see a waving hand from Phil on the other side of my screen.
Yeah, I
Phil,
don't know how to raise electronic hands on this system, Al. So just
the real one worked quite well.
Yes, it does, doesn't it? Yeah. There it goes again. Actually, just to add two things. Number one is I think the 45 seconds beats most current combi boilers, and we are talking about instantaneous domestic hot water, and there lies the difference, because actually you really need stagnant warm water for Legionella to form. And all of that is set out in some great detail in that guidance note that is coming out from CIBSE quite soon as a supporting document to that approach. With the benefit of NHBC buying into that, and I'm hoping Health and Safety Executive buy-in. Maybe you can talk about
Yeah,
that.
if I can comment on that, Phil. HSE have certainly seen the draft guidance and have provided comments. NHBC, as you say, have as well. And the plan, and this responds to another question online, the plan is to have that guidance out very soon. And when I say very soon, I believe that's within days rather than weeks, to support the code of practice. So that's the plan. Now, I am conscious of time.
Very fast point on that is there's a huge test bed for 50 degrees because many district heating networks in Denmark are regulated at 45 degrees out from the HRU, and so there's millions of people where the Legionella is clearly deemed acceptable because millions of people are already operating at 45, so 50 is higher than that. So we should have confidence that it is safe.
Yeah. Thanks, Martin. That's really helpful. Caroline, did you want to come in at that point?
I think it's been well answered. It's all good.
That's great. I think I'd really like to finish up by giving Aaron an opportunity to say the last word. There's been a huge amount of work to produce CP1, and you outlined a great deal of policy activity to enable us to adopt heat networks more extensively in the UK. And I was particularly interested to see your comments about zoning. Perhaps I could ask you to give us a final thought on where you see heat networks fitting into our overall ambition to reduce the 21% CO2 emissions that are coming from heating to something that's perhaps a little bit more consistent with a net zero ambition.
Thanks very much, Carl. I think so. We certainly see heat networks as being integral to the decarbonisation of heat in the UK. We agree with the scale of ambition that CCC put out of about kind of 20% of UK heat demand to meet it cost effectively. That clearly means an enormous rate of growth, which we are aiming to support through our policies such as heat network zoning. And I guess I would point to our support for the Green Heat Network Fund as well, to provide capital support to ensure that heat networks start to shift away from gas-based networks or gas-based generation to lower carbon options. And that's something we want to see happen through government support. We appreciate the Industry Council's commitment on low carbon generation sources as well. And I think the focus and the development of standards that kind of can support that transition is going to be essential. I think maybe if I briefly say on kind of where I think these technical standards can dovetail with future regulation, I think Phil's point on assurance and certification is exactly right. We need to work together, business, BEIS and industry, to make sure that we're starting to build up the infrastructure such that for future regulation, we can be assured that new networks are being built to the highest standards, making sure that standard is flexible and takes into account industry wishes, but is consistent and delivers for consumers as well. And I think I've already said that we're working closely with yourselves, and I look forward to discussing with anyone who has ideas about how we can build that infrastructure in the market as we move towards regulation, such that then a future regulator has the best chance and can as quickly as possible say, yeah, we've got a structure for technical standards, we can work with that, we can make that part of the regulatory requirements, and make sure that system works as effectively as possible.
That's great. Thank you very much, Aaron. I think from a CIBSE perspective, and I'm sure I'm speaking for ADE, we're very keen to work with you and to support government in those ambitions. I'm very mindful from other work that I do that there are other areas where the industry, the wider construction industry, has got challenges about demonstrating that things do what they say on the tin. I'm very grateful to you for that line, Phil. I might pinch it myself in the near future. But we have, as an industry, got to get better at delivering things that really do what they say on the tin. And we've seen the consequences in one or two other areas when products don't do what they say on the tin. And we can't afford that to happen with heat networks if we want them to make the contribution that I think we all want to see. So apologies for overrunning by a couple of minutes, but there was a huge amount to get through. We haven't tackled all of the questions, and I will talk to our speakers and to colleagues to see what we can do to provide some further answers to some of them. It remains for me to say thank you very much to Aaron, Caroline, Phil and Martin for joining us this morning and for presenting and for tackling the questions we have answered. And of course, a very big thank you to all of you for joining us and to my colleague Lucy Bamber at CIBSE and Richard Howard, who made all the technology work in the background reasonably seamlessly. So thank you all very much, and do join us again for our next webinar in the series in a couple of weeks. Thank you very much and goodbye.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, everyone.